This is the Aesthetic Ecosystems Podcast. I'm Ben Hale, your virtual design guide to help you and your family have a healthy, beautiful landscape with less work. What's up, and welcome to episode 14 of the Aesthetic Ecosystems Podcast. Oh man, it is springtime. You know, it's funny actually because here in Ohio, our April has been ridiculous. It's been like we've had some days that feel like summer almost. We've almost hit 80 already, but then we've had days where it's crazy cold. We've had several frost warnings, and yeah, it's just all over the place. That's the Midwest for you guys. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little jealous of you folks that live slightly closer to the equator and are experiencing warmer weather as we speak. Today, when I'm recording this, it's in the 40s right now as opposed to what might be more of a seasonally appropriate temperature. But regardless, I'm happy that there is sunshine. I'm happy that we're seeing lots of birds coming around and things are starting to pop in the garden. We're starting to get a lot of greenery, and that's all exciting and fun. Despite the temperature, it's still fun to get outside and to see things moving around. So before we get into it today, I wanted to share something. I have had some awesome reviews on iTunes so far. I thank you for everybody that's left a review to this point. And if you haven't, please consider doing so. I wanted to share one of the reviews with you today. One of the reviews is from N. Martin, and they say, "Love the new ideas. Can't wait to use these tips and tricks." Thank you very much for sharing that. These reviews go a long way to helping other people understand what the show's about and to really see, you know, if it's worth a listen. So if you think that this show is worth a listen to other people that might be wanting to learn about the show, please consider going to iTunes and leaving an honest review there. And also too, I'm happy to share if you'd like your name and review shared on the podcast. Go on over to aestheticecosystems.com/pod. That's /pod. And right at the top there, you see an option to ask a question or to contact me about the show. And just let me know that you left a review there and leave me your name as well. Right now, iTunes has this weird thing where you have to leave a nickname, and it has to be unique. So it's kind of crazy you can't really leave your name there and expect it to go through as a review. So if you want me to share your name on the show, I'm happy to do so, and I'd sure appreciate you reaching out to me anyway. So thank you very much, and again, consider leaving a review on iTunes if you haven't already. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's get into the topic for today's show. I'm super excited as usual about this topic. Today we are going to be talking about why compost is awesome. That's right, compost is awesome, and if you don't know why, or if you haven't heard people rave about compost, or if you don't rave about compost yourself, I'd love for you to stick around on today's show and really learn what the beauty of compost really is. That's right, it's degraded plant matter. How can that be so beautiful? Well, compost does amazing stuff for us, and it really can make a huge difference in your yard and your landscape if you incorporate compost into your habits and your nutrient cycling in your landscape. So definitely stick around today and learn more about composting. Okay, so what makes compost so cool? Well, first off, compost is one of the safest and best fertility boosters of all time. That's right, folks, all time. So nature has been composting for as long as nature's existed. Basically, composting is simply the cycling of organic matter from a composed form, like a plant, back into a decomposed form, such as soil, good healthy soil. So that's all compost is really, is it's a human version, a human orchestrated version of that same process that trees and prairies and plants have been doing along with their friends bacteria and fungi and all sorts of microcrustaceans have been doing for eons and ages. It's a part of the symbiotic process of cycling nutrients back to be used again. And this is really, really, really important for making sure plants are healthy, because plants rely on the availability of nutrients in the soil, and compost really helps make these nutrients available. This is, if you had one general tool for your garden, compost would most likely be it. It is the general elixir for soil and plant health. So basically, if your soil is having issues or your plants are having issues, there's a good chance that some good doses of compost over time will help alleviate these problems. Again, the main point there is over time. So compost is not something where it's a fast-acting, high-dose thing that's going to solve the exact problem you're having at the time. This is more of a systemic thing where compost used over time boosts the health of your landscape and boosts the health of your plants as well. And this is an age-old practice. So way, way, way back in human history, I'm not a anthropologist, so I'm not going to quote dates here, but there's records of compost processes being used for ages and ages. And composted manure has been used for on-farm fields since the early ages of agriculture. It was found early on that composted material placed on a field that's being used for planting and agriculture can rejuvenate the field and allow it to be used in a much longer time frame without the crops failing. So that was discovered early on, and compost today is also very, very helpful. So let's get into understanding what compost is and where you can get it or how you can make it yourself. This stuff is all really important and really cool. So I kind of mentioned it very shorthanded earlier, but essentially what compost is degraded and digested organic matter. And when I'm talking organic matter, I mean plant material. So broken down plant material. It's basically the recycling of dead plant matter into a substrate that can be used again by plants and soil organisms as well. And it's basically the building blocks of soil, good healthy soil. It's a lot of the healthy parts of good soil. It's a bacterial and fungal digestion, so it's basically the output. I guess in a way, it's kind of like bacteria poop, but it's the digested material that's made from plants into a bioavailable source for plants and other organisms. So basically, as a result, you've got this amazing natural amendment. You're full of biology. If you have a good, healthy, living compost, you've got all sorts of biological life there that's really important for soil health. You also have high levels of organic matter, which is also very important for plant growth. In addition, compost has a pH buffering capacity to it that really helps balance out the soil life as well as plant health for most general plants that you're growing in your soil. In addition, you have a high level of nutrients that are made available to plants. This is both different nutrient compounds as well as minerals that essentially become more soluble or more available to plants and other organisms. And in general, all this sums up together to be a great soil builder for your landscape. And so whether this is your ornamental garden or even your vegetable garden or your lawn, compost really helps anywhere you're trying to grow plants. It's going to, for the most part, it's going to help that plant life. There are, of course, very few exceptions, but in general, most plants are going to really benefit from the addition of compost to your landscape. So let's get into some of the details about what we just talked about and why the different areas make it a better amendment. And then we're going to get into how to use it as well on your landscape. So first, let's touch on my favorite, the biology of it. So I'm just going to try and be really brief here with some of this stuff so we can get to the practical tips as well. But it's really worth mentioning some of the biology and chemistry of compost, and this is just a very, very, very top-level view. There's tons of research that's being done these days on compost because it's over the years it's really been discovered as this great tool in the healthy gardener's toolbox, I guess. as an amendment, and it's really trying to be understood why it's so great and what are the specific elements that go into making compost such a great thing. But for the top level view, you have different types of composts. You have some that are bacterial dominated. You have some that are fungal dominated. But overall, generally preferred is the fungal dominated compost. And if you follow your basic composting process, you'll end up with something that's a healthy balance of both bacteria and fungi. And both of these groups of organisms, the healthy parts of both of these groups of organisms are very important for your soil. So it works out great. And basically, this is you'll hear me mention this a few times, but when you have a compost, an indicator for a lot of different things in compost is the smell. And so when you have your if you have ever picked up or just been in a forest and you kind of smell that sweet, earthy kind of smell that's makes you think of a forest floor, a good healthy forest, that's your fungal compost. So actually, when you have compost, it's actually a great thing to pick it up and smell the compost and just see how it smells. And if it's kind of a pleasant, that earthy kind of sweet smell almost too, you're looking at good, you're smelling and holding good compost, and that's your good fungal life in the compost that's really helping to balance out that and hold together all those organic nutrients present in the compost and to keep them from leaching away and to help balance, hopefully, your plants once you put it in your landscape. And ideally, you do want a fungal-dominated compost, or at least has a healthy amount of fungi present. These really help balance out the soil life. And so while bacteria are important and crucial for a good, healthy soil ecosystem, fungi are also very important. And they're a sign of a more mature ecosystem at the same time. Your compost should not be hot, which means physically temperature hot, and because that's an indication that it's still in the composting process, and that's when you have more of a bacterially dominated process. So the early decomposition phase is, generally speaking, a bacterially dominated process, and while they're good bacteria present there, if it's being done right in the presence of good moisture level and good air level, you don't want to be putting hot compost on your soil because it kind of stops the whole process when you kind of spread it out. Your compost needs to be done in a dense pile if it's done properly for your faster processes. And I mean, when you kind of stop that and spread it too early or whatever, or if you get compost that's not fully composted from, say, a supplier, and you do that, what you end up with is something that's decent, but it's not as good as if you left it to go the complete process. Okay, well, I could probably go on for a quite extensive period of time on the biology of compost, but that's enough for now. And so let's just talk really, really quickly here about the chemistry. And all I really want to say is, for one, it's very high in organic matter because you're putting plant material in, and so what you're getting out is all of that organic matter that generally is eroded. That's the kind of one of the first things that's eroded from your soils. And most of us that live in a developed area are devoid of our topsoils, because when it's developed, a lot of times the topsoil is either scraped off, or during the development phase, your soil becomes so compacted that you end up with poor soil and poor anchoring of the soil. And so your topsoil ends up being washed away during construction as well. So either way, your soil is most likely low in organic matter, is my point here. And so this high organic matter that comes in with your compost is very important. And when I'm saying organic matter, again, earlier I said that means it's plant derived, but even more specifically from a chemistry standpoint, that means it's your carbon and hydrogen chains that are coming in, and it's something important that's important for plant life. And the more you have in your soil, generally speaking, the better. And it's very rare that you have too much organic matter, unless say you have a pot that's filled straight with compost. That's actually too strong for your plants, generally speaking, and not good as well. But when we're talking about just our landscape itself, our gardens and such, it's pretty rare that you have too much. So along with your organic matter, you also have what's called organic acids. So these are organic chain acids that are very important for plant and microbe nutrient transfer. It's a very diverse group of organic acids, but basically they help with nutrient transfer. They help with taking up different nutrients and making them available both to the soil life as well as the plants in the soil. And in general, too, your compost is just good at holding nutrients in place and preventing them from being washed away. So it's good at forming these small aggregate clumps of material that traps in some of these good available nutrients so that other organisms can use them, including plants and microbes. Okay, so now we understand a bit more about what compost is and so what's it made of, both the biological and chemical aspect, as well as why that's important. And so now, how do we actually use it in our landscape? That's important too, right? So, okay, we understand a bit more about it, but what's the practicality, right? What does it really mean for me? So let's understand that a bit more. The first way I think about using compost is simply as an amendment. So if you consider the normal process that people use of spreading a synthetic fertilizer on their landscape, they're walking around with a spreader basically and dropping granules of fertilizer or weed and feed or whatever across their landscape, right, across their yard. Or they might be spreading something around in the garden as well. And instead of that, what you can do is simply replace it with a certain amount of compost instead. So if you really you get some good strained compost, you can actually use it in a spreader similarly to what you would do with your synthetic type material. And instead, you might put on a little heavier amount of compost, because here what you have is it is a concentrated bunch of really good healthy stuff for your soil. You wouldn't want to use it in its full concentration, just 100% compost. But when you spread it out over the soil, it's good to have a healthy amount of compost added as an addition to your soil. So when you're talking about, say, feeding for the fall or early spring are two good times to use it, as I'll mention later again. But you're generally using much more than, say, what you would use with a synthetic fertilizer, because your synthetic fertilizers are very concentrated chemicals that are available very quickly and leach through the soil very quickly, whereas compost is a more a long-term release type thing that's slowly building your soil health. So when we're spreading as amendment, you can do it in late fall, you can do it in early spring, and generally speaking, when you're spreading it, a good thing to do is kind of go through your compost, break up clumps. A lot of people have this like a frame that they make with some hardware cloth and just say some 2x2 or 1x2 material that they can like throw over their wheelbarrow and throw a couple shovelfuls of compost on and really sift through it just really quickly. That's all you want to do, is break up any big clumps or aggregates or material that might not have gotten fully decomposed in there, and it makes it just much easier to work with as you're spreading it throughout your landscape or around your garden beds or whatever. And when you're using it, you can also, if you're making sort of topsoil amendments, you can mix it in your topsoil as well as you're putting this around, and make sure you're covering it. If say with a garden bed, if you're spreading around, it's really good to add a layer of mulch atop that as well, just to protect the compost and prevent it, say, from getting burned by the sun, drying out too much, because again, this is both a living and chemical addition that you're making to the soil. So you want to actually protect the organisms as well to give the fullest benefit to your soil and to get the most out of your compost. The next piece you can do is, this is kind of somewhat of a controversial topic, but compost tea is basically making a liquid concoction of your compost. And there's various methods about how to do this and how to even boost the living organism content above what it currently is in your compost. And I'm not really going to get into the details, but I just want to throw it out there as an option in case you're curious. You can find tons of information on compost tea. But it's another way to basically take your compost and then use it as a liquid amendment, and you can actually spray it over, say, I've done this where I've sprayed it over our lawn, or in your garden beds. You use it as a liquid addition. And what this does is, at first you have to have enough organic matter already present in your soil, but what this does is then it adds some of these soluble materials that are present in your compost, as well as a lot of the living organisms present in your compost. It gives them kind of a direct access to your soil. And so that's another option to do. And one thing I would recommend or almost caution is to always use your compost on the surface. There have been some recommendations here and there about tilling it in. For one, I'm always kind of cautious about tilling. It can really disrupt your soil ecosystem that we're trying to protect for our healthy plants and for low maintenance. And the other thing too is compost is just, it works best on the surface because it's meant as an aerobic environment. That means an environment with oxygen is kind of how we process it when we're making it. And it's important to maintain that, because if it goes anaerobic, it can cause kind of a disruption in your whole ecosystem with your soil. So if you're not putting it on the surface, it can really trigger something you don't want to happen with your soil. So, and that goes if you're even, say, planting a tree. Sometimes, you maybe have heard recommendations to put compost in the planting hole. I actually recommend not to do that. So when you're planting something like a tree or transplanting, instead, after you plant, then top dress over the top of the planting area with compost that can slowly percolate through the soil in a more natural way, a more natural manner that is more like a process that happens in the forest. So something to just kind of caution about there. You don't want to really be putting it underneath the surface where it can cause problems. So where can you get your compost? That's the next piece. And so maybe you're not really set on making your own compost, or it sounds like a ton of work, which I'll get into in just a little bit, but there's also available compost that you can get for anywhere from free to premium compost that might be a little bit more expensive, but nothing that's too outrageous. Because basically here we're, again, talking about decomposed plant material. So what you're paying for is how well the process is managed, what quality of material is going in, and how well it's delivered to you. The first area I would check out is municipalities and local townships and governments. This isn't always the case, but a lot of local areas will collect yard waste, and what they'll do with it is turn it into compost. And so you might be able to access some of this locally sourced compost material, and the municipality does the processing work for you, and then kind of gives it away a lot of times for free or for very low costs for high quantity. And yes, you're not getting maybe the highest quality compost there is, but for the cost, for one, and for the benefit you get out of it, it's very well worth it. And I've utilized this multiple times where there are a couple local areas where I live that have kind of, it's like a free yard waste pickup day, where instead of them picking up your yard waste, you're picking up their decomposed yard waste. So you can get free mulch from the local area, and you can also get free compost as long as you have something to haul it in. And I've actually seen people actually come with, they put a tarp down in their car, and then they put some buckets on top of it, and they'll just fill up the buckets, and it survives the trip home without destroying their car. And that's a good way to get some free high quality material. It's not your world's best compost. It's not closely managed or anything. It's just kind of left to kind of do its own thing, and maybe turned on occasion just to help the breakdown process by the local municipal facilities teams. But what you'll get is still a composted product that has some good value for your landscape, and it's still worth kind of checking out. So that's the first place I would check. If you just kind of want to get a start here, you can get a ton to work with, and for very low expense, and a little bit of effort, but not too outrageous. The next area you could check is landscape suppliers. So this is anywhere from the consumer level supplier, or you can go to those kind of contractor landscape suppliers where they have big bulk distribution of stuff, and you can, order a whole scoop of material, a whole, like front loader bucket of material, cubic yards, and generally get a pretty decent price. Again, here I would really recommend for these sources to do the smell check that I talked about earlier. So smell it and make sure you kind of feel how it feels. If it feels like, good forest topsoil, that's what we're going for here. Is as close as we can get to that is the healthier compost. And so again, back to the landscape supplier. So you can get, a good bulk supply of it. And as long as you have a way to haul it or, rent a truck for an afternoon from your local contractor store, either way, that's a great way to get some compost as well. Again, sometimes it's not the highest quality stuff, but if it passes the smell check, it's probably good enough to use in your landscape. The next step, if you want something that's a bit more convenient, a bit more small scale, you can check out a lot of stores actually carry packaged compost. And so you can check out your local home supply store, as well as one of my local, like there's the local Whole Foods that carries during the growing season. They actually carry packaged organic compost, so that's high quality stuff. I've kind of read through the back label of that just out of curiosity. I've never purchased the product, but it sounds like they do a pretty good job of trying to manage the composting process, the inputs, and the process itself to get a high quality product. And so with these packaged materials, you're generally paying a bit more than, well, of course, more than the free version, but even more than the bulk version as well. But you also might be getting a higher quality product as well. So something to think about there. If you want to start small, or you want to start convenient, or you want to start the clean way, I guess, of hauling it home, you can check some of those options out as well. Now for tips. So again, just to kind of reiterate, you want to make sure your compost passes the smell test. If you get kind of a rotten smell or an off smell, that's not stuff you want to be putting on your landscape because it's most likely gone anaerobic. That's where a lot of the off smells come from, and it's not healthy stuff for your plants. It actually might increase the opportunity for disease or problems with your plants or your soil itself. So try and avoid the stuff that doesn't smell good, or if it feels too like sticky or clayey or whatever, that's also not great stuff. So it you want it to have kind of a loose, crumbly feel, but still clumps together. So it's kind of like a little bit of a wet sponge type thing. If it's dried out, it might not, stick together as much, but you also try and want to avoid the stuff that's too dried out. You want some moisture there as well. Okay, so you also want to get, when I think about composting, I always seem to not have enough. Again, I love this stuff. It's really useful. It's great to just put on your landscape, and it's hard not to do, or it's hard to mess up, I guess. So you can't do too much really, unless you're talking 100% compost. So I would recommend getting as much as your budget allows, and also get more than you think you need, because odds are you'll end up using it, and whatever you don't use, you can kind of tuck in the back corner and save it for a later time, as long as you're not letting it leach away in the rain or whatever. So those are 2 points there as well. So a quick bit on how to make compost. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail, but I want to give you a couple resources as well. But really, the trick here is, if there is a trick, it's you got to maintain your carbon to nitrogen balance. So think of your carbon. A lot of times composters talk about greens and browns. So browns are your carbon, greens are your nitrogen source. So generally speaking, your fresher plant materials are higher in nitrogen, and your deader plant materials are higher in carbon. And you got to have a good ratio. You generally want a lot more carbon than you do nitrogen. So if you have too high nitrogen, that's when you get smelly compost. It's kind of wet and soggy and nasty smelling. You don't want too much of that. But again, you need some of it to accelerate the breakdown process. That's what triggers the bacterial degradation process that starts the composting process. It gets the pile hot so it can heat up and do its thing and break down a lot of that plant material. And then the fungus comes in after that to kind of finish it off and get you a nice balanced product. So the fungus prefers the carbon part, but it you need that nitrogen part to kind of kickstart your pile at the same time. So make sure you have a good ratio there. And again, this isn't rocket science. So if it starts smelling, you add more dry material, your leaves, your old dried grass clippings, straw, hay, that sort of thing. Or if it's not moving very much, you're not getting a good amount of moisture in there, and it doesn't seem to be doing anything, then you need more nitrogen stuff. Your greens. So you add fresh grass clippings or freshly trimmed plants or whatever. Or you can even do something like coffee grounds is actually a good nitrogen source to help kickstart your pile. So that's kind of some tips when you're making your own pile. Generally speaking, you need a pile big enough. They recommend 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot, which is actually a lot of material when you come to think about it. But I'm here to say you don't need actually that much to get started. If you're looking just to get started here and make something, you can start with less than that. But you want to accumulate somewhat before you go ahead and try and start composting. Another thing people are concerned about is how much do you have to turn it, right? Again, this isn't rocket science here. So if you put together a pile and you just say, what I like to do actually with our yard is just kind of starting in layers. So we actually use a lot of our kitchen waste that's safe for composting. So no meats, no dairy that we put in our compost, but most vegetable-based outputs, waste from our kitchen is put in the compost pile. And we layer it with just leaves or some straw or whatever kind of dried material we have laying around to kind of keep some critters out of it, as well as form a good layering of both carbon and nitrogen. So we let that accumulate over several months actually until we have enough to really start making some compost. And then we go to the next bin to start filling that. So we have a 3-bin system. Not necessary, but more convenient when you really get into composting. And that first bin, once you kind of leave it go, you can actually just let it go. And it will take longer, but you'll get compost out of it eventually if you just let it go. Or if you want it to speed up, you actually turn it. So you can take a fork or a spade and kind of turn your compost. So flip the pile over, dig through it, flip it over a couple times. If you want it faster, you do it more often. If you want it to be slower or less work, you just do it less often. And that's it, really. And eventually you'll start to see everything broken down, get your nice compost. And again, you use temperature and smell as your indicator. So if it's not super hot anymore, that means it's most likely most finished off, and you can start using it. And if it smells good, again, that means you probably have good compost. And that's really it, guys. I'm not going to get any more detailed than that today because those are the basics. And the key here is just to get started, to get something on your landscape that's going to help boost your soil health. And again, the more healthy our soil is, generally speaking, the less work we have to do in our landscape because the plants are happier, they're healthier, they're going to take care of themselves, and we don't have to do it. So that's the awesome thing about good, healthy soil is it leads to good, healthy plants and a good, healthy family, right? So on that rosy note, I think I'm going to wrap up there. The other points I want to make here real quick is if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, I've got a couple resources in the show notes, but just a few points. One is the Rodale Institute is long been researching compost and the benefits of composting, and they have a great book that's a guide to composting, and it covers all different ways you can do composting at the home scale. And so it's worth checking out if you really want to nerd out on this stuff like I do. It's definitely worth a check out. And also, just go to YouTube and see what people are doing there. There's tons of different ideas on how to do composting: the easy way, the fast way, the lazy way, the simple way, the cheap way, whatever. And see what fits for you, the pretty way, right? How it looks nice in your landscape. How can you do it that looks nice? Stuff like that. So just go check out YouTube or something like that. Google, they're both your friend here when you want to learn more about compost. And there's just tons of free, great resources out there about composting. And I'll also have some great links in the show notes as well. I do have a link to a friend of mine who has some great stuff over at the 10th Acre Farm. So Amy Strauss, 10thacrefarm.com. She has a great article on composting. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Definitely worth a check out there. If you just want to get started in this, she has a great guide on just getting started with composting and also how to build a great compost bin for pretty easy, pretty cheap as well. So that's it, guys. The next bits, if you want to ask a question again, you can go over to aestheticecosystems.com/pod, P-O-D, and there you can get in touch with me to ask a question to get featured on the show, or just, to ask a question in general. And just drop me a note there, and I'll be happy to get back to you. I'll be happy to share your question on the show as well if you like. And with that too, check out the show notes. Any of the links we talked about in the show today are available in the show notes. And you can also go to aestheticecosystems.com/episode 14 or episode 14 to go and see the comments there as well for the show, and to get involved in the discussion, and also to see all the links there. So the last thing too, again, if you haven't been over to iTunes to leave a review for the show, I'd really appreciate that. Like Ann Martin did, as I shared today. And I also want to just share a big thank you to everyone listening. I really appreciate your time listening to this show. And I also really appreciate you taking action in your landscape. That's why I'm here, is I want to help you change your life through your landscape to have more beauty, more health with your family, and also more time with your family. That's really why I'm doing this show. So thank you so much for listening, and also thank you for committing to taking action. I really want you to commit to take action in your landscape, to improve your landscape and improve your life through your landscape. So just really consider what you can do after listening to this. What's something that you can do, what you can take away either from this show or from other shows, to really make a positive difference for your landscape and for your life and your family. So with that, guys, thanks for tuning in, and make sure you live with passion and make tomorrow better than today.